having somewhere where you can anchor your trust in, which is independent and not paid for by the coffers of big businesses or politicians, is our moment.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Media Voices. We are a media-focused B2B operation that looks at everything to do with journalism, editorial content, absolutely everything under the aegis of media. I'm Chris Sutcliffe.
I'm Esther Thorpe.
And I'm Peter Houston.
Or Mr. Houston, as I believe we have to call you now since the wedding.
Yeah, I wasn't here last week because I went and got married. Woo! To Joanna.
Part of me was wondering, like, are you going to launch a magazine from the wedding or something, like, you know?
Newspaper Club does this thing where you can do, like, I don't know, 50 copies for not a huge amount of money about your wedding.
That's actually quite cute. But if anybody's going to do that, that'd totally be you guys.
Kind of geeky.
That clip you just heard was from Nada Arnot, who is Executive Vice President of Marketing for The Economist. Now, we don't often speak to the marketing arm of newspapers and magazines, except where that marketing activity intersects with selling subscriptions. But The Economist has just launched its largest brand campaign since the early 2000s. So I spoke to Nada about how the news-focused magazine is seeking to attract younger readers, why she believes long-term brand building is vital in today's news ecosystem, and the future plans for marketing The Economist.
Do you know, I think this might be part of the industry's problem is we don't speak to marketing people enough. So there's been some stuff out this week, and I was talking to Chris Stone for a piece this week where he was like, you can't launch stuff and then not have a marketing plan for it.
And I actually asked her about that, about why the industry doesn't take brand building and kind of that marketing side as seriously as it probably should. So yeah, really good.
Keep listening then.
Exactly, yeah. But this first story is one of the more infuriating ones I think that we've all come across. Esther, why don't you take us through what is going on with 32 media companies who are seeking a suit against Google?
So, I mean, this broke sort of late last week that there are 32 media and publishing organisations that have come together. People like Axel Springer, Sheepstead, they've come together and jointly filed this €2.1 billion, which is around $2.3 billion, antitrust lawsuit against Alphabet and Google. Please excuse my pronunciation, but there's organisations from all across Europe. There's Kroon in Austria, DPG Media in Belgium, Mediahuis from Denmark's TV2. There's all sorts, quite a lot of sort of Ringier from Switzerland. And they've decided that they're going to file this suit in the Netherlands because the Netherlands has been historically quite sympathetic to antitrust lawsuits. And they basically say they have suffered significant financial losses as a result of Google's anti-competitive practices in the digital advertising sector specifically. I'm going to leave the quotes to you guys because these actually drove me a bit mad. Anyway.
Well, yes, you can absolutely argue that Google is anti-competitive. It is so dominant within the search space in particular. What I think you cannot do, and Peter, I'm sure you'll back me up on this, is effectively write alternate history fan fiction of how well media companies would be doing without Google and then use that to base a lawsuit.
Well, Google's position is because Google's technology is really good and has been for decades. And that idea, what was this? These funds could have been reinvested into strengthening the European media landscape because media owners are really, really good at reinvesting. This whole thing is like, Chris and I were laughing earlier on this. It reminded me of that Gino DeCampo thing where Holly Willoughby tries to compare his macaroni cheese to a carbonara. And he says, well, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bike. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
If Google wasn't there, we'd be doing great. Well, no.
Well, would we be suing, Samsung and Apple for building mobile phones and affecting print sales? Like,
it's extremely spurious, isn't it? It smacks of, we have seen there's blood in the water here because of things like the Australia deal and what's going on in Canada, and we just kind of want a piece of the pie. And to ask your point about actually where it's been filed, that I think is quite smart but cynically motivated. It reminds me of, so I watched the evidence session from the House of Lords the other week about what the kind of media and tech and how media's been impacted by the tech landscape. And to hear David Dinsmore talk, you would think that Google had physically rocked up to News UK's offices, pulled the door off the safe and just emptied it out. Whereas, of course, that's not what happened. And the lack of any self-recrimination or even self-examination about the fact that, media companies have effectively, through whether passivity or being slow to act, contributed to this position was just, it wasn't there.
I can remember writing about this for the Media Moments report because I landed it with the platforms chapter, and there were 2 studies that came out towards the end of last year, and one was sort of saying on the one extreme end, we calculate that Google owes publishers like millions and millions and millions of of dollars. And on the other end, it was like, well, actually, we calculate that publishers have got this amount of value from being featured in Google search results and all that traffic that Google has been driving them. And you just can't, like, these were both kind of professional studies. And they just both came out at completely opposite ends of the spectrum.
And it's not only that, it's that the fact that kind of the publisher's estimation of, how much Google owes them is so vast. Google says it's this much, but we think it's like 50 times that much. And there's just kind of no adults in a room getting around a table together and going, actually, you know what? Can we try to work out something a little bit more realistic?
That 100% is a problem. No one's actually looking at the reality of this. I'm not, I'm not defending, or I wouldn't defend Google in the sense of, well, Google can do what the hell it wants. There's lots of stuff that Google needs to fix. We talked about this the other day, didn't we, about sort of bogus AI-generated content, particularly around affiliate deals and whatever. So there's loads of stuff they've got to do. And if they've broken specific antitrust rules, then they should be held accountable and they should be made to pay whatever. But I think I said this in the newsletter. For publishers to just be trying to get money back in fines is not a sustainable business model.
I've not popped this into the notes yet because it's literally only just broken. Meta, unsurprisingly, said that they're not going to renew a bunch of their commercial deals that they struck with Australia.
I just saw this.
Yeah.
Which is not at all surprising given their position. And so this was Australia put this this sort of news bargaining type code in place, and after sort of a lot of barneying, eventually Meta and Google paid a bunch of licensing deals. Those are now expiring because that was 4 or 5 years ago. And Meta have been like, well, we're not renewing them and news is not important for our platform. And they're kind of thrown the gauntlet down a bit. ABC, which is one of the Australian broadcasters, said that they'd used funds from the deals to create 60 regional jobs. And they've just said, oh, well, it's important that this whole situation is going to create a financial challenge for the ABC that needs to be resolved. And that we need to continue to work with government to do that.
This was like just after this news broke, I saw Jeff Jarvis tweeted. And, as you might expect, he's quite strident about this. He said, Facebook's divorce from news continues. Dead news tab, no new deals for traditional news, no products made for publishers. Moral to this story, be careful what you lobby for, publishers. You attacked Facebook on every front. What did you expect? Hugs.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Go, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. And it's that ABC example is really fucking disingenuous as well, because they created 60 regional jobs, right? But they are one of the largest news organizations in there. The whole point when this deal was mooted was that the money would go to some of the money, rather, would go to independent news outlets. And to go back to this hearing, Yoshi Herman, Mill Media, was there talking to Henry Ford Walker of NewsQuest and David Higginson from Reach PLC. And they were saying, actually, we need government money to come to us for advertising because we, can then use that to develop more regional stuff. But you're the biggest players in that space. You are the biggest regional publishers, and that will just cut places like Mill Media and other independent titles out of it.
It's already happening now.
Well, yeah, but we need a conversation about relative size here.
David Floyd at Social Spider talks about this, about money going to zombie publications.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which have no staffing, but they're still taking public notices. It's the bottom line of this, and the adult conversation thing is really important. It's a mess, and no one is actually stepping up to say, here's what we should be doing about this. It does matter because Don Ponsford wrote a thing in press, because it may have been this week, last week, sorry, saying that he had sent a tip about a stabbing in his area, which is, is in Sussex, and I'm guessing there's not that many stabbings. And no one followed it up. And then when the person that had done the stabbing was sentenced, he tipped him off again, and no one followed it up. So if that kind of local reporting, or whether that's court reporting, whether that's roads, whether that's local democracy. If that's not getting done by, I don't know, what professional outfits, then society is weaker. Definitely is weaker. And I know Mrs. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, but we all know how fucking wrong she was.
That's the Thatcher quota for the for this episode reached. But I mean, it does matter in that sense. But Esther, you've made a really good point in the news roundup.
Does any of this matter anyway? Because there is a giant Amazon whale coming up behind us, ready to swallow everything up. And I don't think we're at all ready for this. Okay, so Press Gazette have done quite a good roundup of a bunch of data from Walk and Insider Intelligence and eMarketer to show that the share of online ad revenue going to Google and Meta is actually in decline. Like they're getting more money, but proportionally less. The gains in share and ad spend aren't going back to news media or content publishers. Are we shocked?
What?
Instead, they're going to a third wave of retail media like Amazon, Walmart, and apparently now TikTok. So Walk's data shows content media ad spend, which includes all publishers like TV, cinema, and radio, is going to fall to a 27.2% global share in 2024, down from 71% a decade earlier, which, like, that's a steep drop. You can see why people are complaining.
Esther wins the understatement of the year so far.
But as marketers have begun to realize they can place ads directly where people are already shopping, aka Amazon, they're like, well, why do we need to put adverts on anywhere else? If people are searching for night lights, let's put my nightlight advert in Amazon where people are searching for night lights, and you close that gap between intent and purchase as close as you possibly can.
Yeah, I did quite a lot of reporting into retail media quite recently, and the hunger there is palpable. You can just sense the idea that advertisers are looking, particularly those for like FMCG and a bunch of kind of the very fast-moving, low-value items. They are all going to be putting their money in retail media because that's where performance marketing lives and dies, and that's where people can convert more easily.
I think there's going to have to be a bit of a reckoning on this, because I've actually stopped using Amazon in recent years, because you go to it and you search for something and it's just all sponsored content. And you're there like, okay, well, who actually, like, what is actually a good, night lights, for an example? I actually ended up going to Which in the end and reading their recommendations. But I was like, if I'm searching for a night light on here, what is kind of cheap imported tat that has just paid to have the sponsorship slot and paid to have the fake reviews and all that sort of thing? And what is an actually good night light? And that is where publishers have possibly got a bit of an opportunity to get back in. Yeah, Will they do it? I don't know. But we're sort of only at the start of wading through all that, where I think people realise they actually need the humans to look at the products, look at the content. And our guests last week were talking about this.
I was just about to bring that up.
You need the humans to be like, this is a crap smartwatch, or this is a great nightlight.
I think that's
the fact
where
that you went to Which, though, is really interesting.
I know. I was just about to say, yeah. I think that's where Which is kind of a bit of an outlier, because that's always been their thing. They've always had that provenance. Humans are testing it.
So it's Which and Good Housekeeping are the two that I actually intentionally go to for product reviews, because I know about Good Housekeeping's Institute, where they they test all the washing machines and the vacuum cleaners, and so I just want to know, like, if humans checked, it turns on. And I think that there was an interesting Press Gazette note in this piece, which actually feeds really nicely into what we were discussing in the first story. They said that the pandemic has taught marketers lessons that were brutal for online news publishers. People were willing to shop for just about anything online, even fresh groceries, and the best place to reach them was on the sites where they were already shopping, not news sites. I can't argue with that.
If you're in the market for a £10,000 watch,
or a yacht,
you're unlikely to go to an Amazon sponsored review.
Yeah. I want a mega yacht. I'll just go to Amazon and first one, that's fine. Prime, get this yacht here tomorrow.
I think there's still a huge opportunity there. There's a guy I used to work with at Dennis who's gone and started a site called Totally EV, and he reviews electric vehicles. And he's gone from being like unemployed 4 years ago to now having like 4.9 million views on YouTube. He's reviewed over 100 different vehicles, and he's kind of got this little publishing model himself. And there's still a space for things like that. Like, you're not going to, well, I hope you wouldn't just go to Amazon and just buy an electric vehicle. But you want to know somebody's sat in it and checked it and said, this is what it feels like to drive. And I think it's just, okay, nightlights are maybe one extreme end, but you kind of got the thing about smartwatches. You want to know, what does it feel like on somebody's wrist? Is it easy to navigate? Does it keep flicking on in the middle of the night? You need humans for this.
So what, if anything, can we learn from these two stories? The first about, these suing Google, and the second about Amazon potentially disrupting Google's ad revenue.
So I'm aware that we sound very pro-Google. That there are issues with Google, and
I think, I do want to say, actually, before we get going, we are not pro-Google. I think what we are is pro-realism, debating on, legitimate grounds, not coming at this from a cynical angle, because then you just get argy-bargy. You get stuff like Facebook cutting news, taking news away from people who might necessarily need it, and you also then get publishers completely disrespecting smaller publishers in service of chasing revenue like that.
To listen to some of the bigger publishers beating their chest and clutching their pearls and what other outrage metaphors we can come up with, it's just kind of bollocks, right? Because what are they doing? They're running stories about the wrong McDonald's delivery, or what's new on the shelves at Marks and Spencer's. Or I saw someone this morning, one of the local kind of live sites, reporting on someone's private jet that had to be redirected, and they were basically taking the piss. Didn't realise she was a local girl. Obviously she's not. She's a Hollywood whatever artist. The whole thing is just a mess, and for them to be beating their chest and saying, "You're stopping us doing a great job of covering local news and covering local democracy," it's just utter cynical bollocks.
It's a wider conversation than local news, though, isn't it? And I think this is the thing, is that these decisions do affect people like the Guardian, the bigger, the Times, the bigger publishers and magazine publishers as well. But I think, as a general thing, and this is my issue with things like the Press Gazette campaign against it, is that news sites publishers are not entitled to ad revenue.
No.
And I think if you look at it, if you completely step away from it, look at it from the perspective of the sellers and the ad buyers, if you want to sell a bike and you're a bike retailer, you've got a bunch of bikes to sell, you've got a choice between advertising on, I'm going to pick on The Guardian, for example, advertising on a bike publication, let's say Single Track World, or advertising on Amazon when somebody is searching for bike. If you have tight budgets, you are 100% going to spend your money on Amazon, because that captures that person at that point of intent. And I think maybe you'd go to Single Track World if you've got some spare, because you kind of maybe want the halo of being with bike fanatics. And this isn't a case of the triopoly or whatever we're calling them now stealing ad money. It's that newspapers are no longer the gatekeepers of the media ecosystem in the way they used to be.
The one thing I would say is that Mr. Mark Alco would argue that you should not be buying bikes from Amazon.
Sorry, Mark.
You should be buying bikes from specialist retailers that actually particularly that kind of bike. But yeah, you're right.
And yet we're in this place where not only
do we all agree?
We all...
we agree on the principles, but I have some issues with this whole situation. Because just what a shitty, soulless, transactional world we're building for ourselves.
Yeah.
If you relate this back to the music review stuff that I wrote that thing on Pitchfork, and Casey Newton talking about how the algorithm is not going to give him something that he's surprised that he loves. And I think that's what both newspapers and magazines have done well for a very, very, very long time, is create a demand for stuff, create a market.
That only applies to a select proportion of publications, and those that have relied for a long time on cheap digital advertising are the ones that I think, and it's the same ones that have gone into cheap affiliate revenue and really picking up the low-hanging fruit. That they're the ones that are really, really going to struggle with this.
This week, I spoke to Nada Arnot, who is EVP of Marketing at The Economist, as the title launches its biggest brand campaign since the early 2000s. So she has a background in marketing for media companies, having previously worked at BritBox, Hearst, a bunch of other titles, but a news-focused publication is obviously a very different beast. So I first asked her what it was about The Economist that attracted her to the role.
Yeah, I started marketing about oh goodness, over 20 years ago. I keep shocking myself every time I say that. And I sort of fell into marketing when I started a website in 2004 and realized I actually really quite liked it. And what I liked about it was, one, the immediacy of the results that you get when you run any digital marketing campaign. But when I segued that experience into media, I realized it was even more exciting, because in the media world, it's fast paced. You're dealing with new information at every given time. Nothing is ever the same day to day, because it's either content in the entertainment space or it's content in the news space. You're always chasing something slightly different and new and exciting. And it's very relevant to millions and millions of people's lives. And so it just feels quite important and also very exciting.
Nice. Well, you've already preempted my next question there, which is, to what extent is marketing within this space predicated on the content, kind of the bread and butter of what media companies are doing?
Yeah. And, it's interesting. In the entertainment space, it was very much content led. And it was very much promoting new shows, new movies, whatever was sort of new and trending. In the news space, we're less about the show promotion model, but it's still very much relevant in the sense that I like to get the brand out there, but it's better if I show you what the brand is about. And I can show you what the brand is about by showing you the content. So content marketing is actually a really big part of what we do in my team at The Economist, largely because, listen, what we do is we sell journalism, and the best way to show how amazing the journalism is to give you a flavor of it.
See, that's so fascinating as well, because if you look at what I suppose is the places that are doing really, really well in terms of news media at the moment, the MIT, some of the what the UK papers are doing, obviously The Economist, it does tend to be about engendering that sense that the content is worth paying for, that the journalism itself is really what's powering the mission. So how are you getting that across in practice?
Yeah. So we've, a big part of our strategy is on Meta, for example, where we're actually just using articles to get out in front of different audiences. And so the articles are, they have the headline that is catchy. It's not clickbait, but it's catchy, and it's meant to resonate with the audience that we're targeting. Someone clicks through, they get to that article, they get to read it, and then they sign up. And so really we don't even have to say to you, by the way, the content is so amazing and our journalism is worth paying for, because they see it live and they interact with it. Once you get into a world, and I was very passionate about this when I started, once you get into a world where you start explaining, oh, we have X number of new articles a day or a week, and you get these 3 benefits, and you get it all for this price, you suddenly commoditize what you're selling. And it's really hard to show the true value, because all a consumer will do is eventually compare you to another publisher, when really what is different and worth buying is what's intrinsically different about the style of journalism. And you can't communicate that in a unique selling proposition bullet.
See, that's so fascinating. That's the first time I've heard it articulated, that effectively by doing sort of I suppose, putting yourself out there as a commodity news organization, you are setting yourself up for comparisons to everybody else. And that seems to, predicate that race to the bottom in a lot of ways.
Yes, absolutely. It's a race to the bottom. It becomes a numbers game. Someone once told me, it's like the pizza wars of the 90s, right? So who can give you the bigger pizza for less cost? And at some point, you're just giving away massive pizza for free, and it doesn't do anyone any good. And similarly, if we say we have 1,000 articles, someone else comes in and says, I have 1,001, right? And then you have 1,002, and then you're just chasing that number, and then you're also then chasing the lowest price, which is it's not a winning game.
No, of course. Then to go back to that pizza analogy, then the quality becomes worse. The toppings become more limited. Yeah. What? We could chase that analogy for the rest of the session. So let's abandon that one now. So there's a new campaign underway to market The Economist. How do you describe it? How is it a change from what's come before?
Yep. So this is the first time that we have embarked on a big brand campaign since probably early 2000s. And so we're taking a little bit of what we did previously, which is that iconic white font on red background, but we've changed the tone of what we're messaging slightly to be broader reaching, a little bit more inclusive, appealing to a younger demographic, more gender-based, balanced demographic. The premise of it was actually it came out of a research project that we did last year around what is it about The Economist that actually resonates with this broader demographic? What do they see as a differentiator, and what does it mean to them? And what bubbled up was this notion of independent journalism. That really stood out as something that was really important to this audience. So we used that as our foundation. So we landed on a campaign tagline, independent journalism for independent thinking. And then we layered on some really clever tongue-in-cheek headlines that are completely in the vein of what you would expect from The Economist. One, which is my favorite, is for fact's sake. And the reason why we landed on that
Love it.
was because we're in this world now of all-time high, low trust in news, proliferation of fake news and disinformation. So this cacophony of noise is the moment for us to come in and reinforce what we've been doing for 180 years, which is providing clarity in this world of somewhat chaotic swirl, and it's even worse now. And so for fact's sake is meant to say, we have fact-based journalism, but also we understand the frustration that you're facing. So that's how we landed on that. And we've creative tested and did tons of research around whether that would resonate. And all the results suggested that it was exactly on point with the audience we're trying to reach.
Nice. Fantastic. Well, we can get more into the audience in a second. I just wondered, I've been talking to people for the last couple of weeks, months now, and that independence as a selling point has been brought to the fore time and time and time again. People feel, in a lot of cases, disenfranchised. They feel like there are, a lot of the big newspaper organizations don't necessarily speak on their behalf or are, by people like them. Why do you feel like now is the right time to really land that message? Is this something is this a feeling that has bubbled to the fore most recently, or is it just something that has been identified more recently?
Yeah, I think it has reached this sort of tipping point, right? I think it really started several years ago, actually, with probably the last U.S. election, but also just the way people are consuming and finding news generally it's a big challenge to the news industry, but I think it's a greater challenge to society, actually. And people are finding news through the side doors, which is through search and through social in particular, and you never really know what is a truly fact-based, rigorous form of journalism. Is this true? Is this spun? Is it, completely fake? And that has just become more acute now that particularly the younger generations, Gen Zs, most notably, are just swirling around articles or videos that they find in social media from their social media influencers, from personalities. And, I read a stat the other day that Gen Z trust personalities on TikTok and Instagram more than they do journalists, right? Yeah. And so I think this notion of what is actually good journalism is bothering a lot of people in society. And so having somewhere where you can anchor your trust in, which is independent and not paid for by the coffers of big businesses or politicians, it's our moment.
So I can't imagine for a second that people would look at The Economist and go, that has ever not been independent. It's never not been doing great independent journalism. So how are you seeking to move that on in people's minds? How are you really seeking to land that message with people through the marketing comms? Yeah.
So the people who know The Economist know that about The Economist. They've never questioned it. They've never really sat back and said, I wonder if they've lost their independence. It's the younger audience, right? So, years ago when we were purely print, you saw people, maybe your parents, reading The Economist. They left The Economist magazine on their coffee table, and that's how kids got exposed to it. Well, now we're more digital. You have no idea what your parents are reading or your friends are reading on their phones.
Which is worrying. I wish I knew what my parents were reading at any given point.
I want to know what they're doing. It's interesting because that conversation started when a kid sees their parent reading the magazine, then the parent can educate the child as to, oh, this is a really good source of journalism because it's independent. That's breaking now, right? And so having a campaign and reinforcing that message of independent journalism in everything that we do digitally in particular is really important, because that's our way of telling the brand story and brand value to newer audiences that might not have had that hand me down from their parents.
So you've touched upon this a little bit, but I want to make it quite explicit if we can. So you've mentioned new audiences, you mentioned, social platforms as well. Who are these new audiences you're seeking to reach? What broad demographics are you trying to scoop up there? And what platforms and channels are you using to speak to them?
Yeah. So we're looking to age down, as probably most legacy brands are. Students are a really big priority for us, especially in university, because we see that we bring a ton of value to the university student during their studies, and it's a great way to start building that relationship as they progress through their professional lives. So aging down and then balancing the gender portfolio to be a little bit more female. In terms of how we're looking to reach them, there's the marketing channel strategy, and then there's also the marketing product strategy. And so on the channel side, we're using, no big surprise, the paid search, paid social, and that's primarily showcasing our content. And then a ton of content recommendation platforms, again, showcasing our platform, our articles, and then podcast marketing, a lot of audio marketing. In terms of the product side, we push the monthly free trial, which is really meant to give that no risk, try before you buy option for audiences that kind of grew up in that subscription world where they're used to the free trial. We have Espresso, which is our mobile only product, and that is meant to reach the Gen Z who are mobile, not only mobile first, they don't know a world without mobile.
Without mobile, yeah.
Yeah, which is shocking. And my kids always ask me, like, how did you ever survive? I'm like, I'm Gen X. I'm resilient. Like, throw us in the wild. It was like free reign parenting to like a whole nother level. So we're okay. But it's also a lower price point for Espresso, so that gets in front of the younger audience, and it's built in a way that is aligned with their grazing news consumption habits. And then we have podcasts that we just launched, and that's meant to really tap into that more female demographic who tends to be podcast listeners, people who are time poor. They like to consume their news on the go, and it's another very low price point, so that we can get people in who might be very price sensitive.
So, I mean, there's a huge range of messages and products you're seeking to land there. I wondered how you're actually going about measuring the success of a campaign like this. It's obviously very different when you do have the kind of performance-led marketing approach where you can just kind of look at conversions. But for a brand campaign like this, how are you actually going about measuring that in the long term?
Yep. So we look at long-term, we look at brand awareness. But to move a big ship, particularly in a market like the US, it'll take 12 to 18 months before we start seeing any real movement. But we look at brand awareness, we look at brand consideration, purchase intent. Those are, again, 12 to 18 months down the road, we'll see how we move the needle. In the interim, we look at brand lift. So in specific channels that you don't have performance metrics such as audio or TV or out of home, we look at brand recall. We look at likelihood to have taken an action. So did they go to the website, or did they tell a friend to check out The Economist? So those are our little moments in time. And then we layer on an additional level of data, which is media mix modeling, to understand the impact of each channel and how they're all working together.
Nice. It was only a couple of years ago where I got introduced to mixed media modeling as a term, and since then it's exploded. I see it all over the place. I suppose then the question that naturally follows from that is, you mentioned, and it's really refreshing actually to hear that you might not see, well, you won't see any sort of tangible results for 12, 18 months there. But I wondered when when the team was pitching a brand campaign to a place like The Economist, media budgets are so stretched at the moment. How do you get buy-in from the wider team to actually do a campaign like this? Because on the face of it, a lot of people will still see it as a cost and not an investment.
Yes, exactly. So when I started the conversation, I mean, there was already an appetite to get more of the brand out there. But the inclination was it should be driving direct performance. And so there was a little bit of an education that had to go on in terms of the value of brand marketing for performance marketing. So if you think about the funnel, you don't have your brand awareness at the very top, there's no way you're widening the funnel. Your funnel suddenly becomes a cylinder, right? and your top is so narrow that the fewer people you have at the top, it means the fewer people you need at the bottom. And it just gets narrower and narrower and narrower. A lot of brands, particularly during COVID, turned off brand awareness marketing because people weren't out. So it didn't make sense, right? And a lot of brands said, oh, that actually worked. We didn't see any impact on our conversions.
But there was, during COVID, like that's, you basically strip that out of any modeling behavior. It's its own unique beast.
Completely. And so then, and a lot of brands saw a nice high off of COVID because people were home. And so they didn't realize what was actually happening. There were storm clouds ahead. So then fast forward a few years and they realized, brands in general realized, oh, wow, we have fewer people at the bottom to convert because we didn't tell them about us at the very top. So when I tell that story, it's easier for the economist to realize, actually, we need to keep investing in the top of the funnel. And this is the way to do it. And building the comfort that we do have metrics we can look at throughout to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. It's just, you won't see a massive game-changing shift in brand awareness for a while.
And yeah, it's interesting though, because so much of what makes a successful media business is longevity, is provenance of, value over time. So you would have thought that brand campaigns like this would be much more readily obvious in the general public, in their consumption. I remember the Telegraph did one not too many years ago that was all about trumpeting their access to Whitehall, which kind of goes against that kind of independent journalism angle you were talking about there. Yeah. Why do you think it is so rare that we see these long-term brand building campaigns on behalf of media brands?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at entertainment media brands, they know the value of it.
Yeah.
It's usually the brands that rely less on big ticket shows or movies that tend to see their brand campaign budgets cut because it isn't immediate. And so they don't realize the true value that it's driving even downstream in the short term. And so it's the first line that ever gets cut because you look at your budget and you say, well, what's the return on investment of that? Well, I don't know. I can't measure it. Okay, well, if you can't measure means that it has no value. But that's the absolute wrong way to think about it because it is what fuels the rest of the machine. And so that's why I think a lot of news publishers in particular, they still think very much in the commodity space and that they'll lead more with get the subscription for $1 a week, for example, or £1 a week and chase the pricing game versus building equity in your brand. And I always use Apple is obviously a very different industry, but you think about it, it's ludicrous. When the iPhone came out in 2004 or 5, who would have thought that we'd all be walking around and have our children who are completely reckless and irresponsible walking around $1,500 devices in their pockets, right?
And it would just be normal.
It'd be normal. And everyone says that's okay. So they never talk about price because they talk about the value you get by having an iPhone, not the price point or the features.
So a couple of times you mentioned the US as a focus for the campaign and younger audiences. And from, I'm sort of out of the marketing game now, writing about marketing, but from everything I heard for years and years, it's important to have sort of a local voice telling the story of a brand in a lot of cases. So how is The Economist, as a very international focused organization, actually making sure that the message is appropriate to kind of those younger people in the US and having it feel authentic to them?
Yep. So we actually stay very true to our pure identity. So we don't try to localize too much other than
interesting.
Yeah. And other than removing anything that might be too colloquial from a British perspective, right? Like if it doesn't if the idiom doesn't land in the US, then we won't use it. But otherwise, we still use British English writing, which I'm Canadian, so it feels just like home. So we'll use that. We'll use the same cleverness, which is actually, it travels well internationally. Like it's uniquely like universal, and yet there's something very uniquely British about it, which I think resonates really well with the U.S. audience in a surprising way.
I was going to say that is surprising. That's really fascinating as well, because I know of a couple of media brands in the UK who are almost doing the opposite now. They're shifting away from that. They're having, American colloquialisms and everything, aphorisms, just kind of working their way into the British copy, and it's causing some consternation there. So it's interesting to feel like it's not going that way the other way around. Yeah. So this is obviously, it's still really early in the kind of the launch cycle for a campaign like this. To what extent will you be tweaking it as you go along, as you sort of start seeing those early results? And how much freedom is there within there to actually iterate on what's come before? So
I think what you will see as a constant will be that campaign tagline of independent journalism for independent thinking. That is unwavering. We want to stay true to that. We will be refreshing the clever headlines throughout the campaign. The campaign is currently planned for 12 months, but it is something that I want to continue as an always-on line in our marketing strategy. You'll see us spike and sustain throughout the year. So during key moments, it will spike up with additional media. Because we constantly get creative testing input, we constantly get other data signals, we will be iterating, and we have full liberty to iterate on the creatives otherwise. So you'll start seeing new TV spots. We have one set going live tomorrow.
Oh, very nice.
March 1st, and then we'll keep refreshing throughout the year. We have radios that ads that will refresh, and then all of our out-of-home will refresh, so that it just feels like a fresh take on that overarching campaign of independent journalism.
Nice. And you preempted my question about whether there are certain events coming up throughout the calendar year that you were going to seek to align yourself around. Sounds like that's something you're going to be doing with that spike and sustain.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I can't share some things that are coming in the summer, but that we will definitely be aligning around the U.S. election.
Of course, makes sense.
We take advantage of that, and it is such a massive election year globally, so we will be aligning with other big election moments globally as well.
When you are approaching new audiences entirely, you're coming at them from a cold start, I suppose. So are you trying to replicate that feeling, or are you trying to speak to them in a way that is, obviously it's creating a new behavior for them, actually coming to and reading The Economist, subscribing to The Economist? To what extent do you feel like there is a chance to turn that new audience into kind of the same as the existing audience in terms of how they feel, how they think about The Economist?
Yeah, and it's a lot of that happens when they come into our subscriber base. And so that happens, that communication happens with the way that we onboard them, expose them to all the benefits that they have with their subscription. So trying to get them habituated to using the app, to attending our really exclusive live events where they can see our journalists and thought leaders in the industry. So that as soon as we can get them in and expose them to that full experience, they then become very much like the previous subscribers. They don't behave the same because they're obviously a different generation, but they build their own connection with the brand because they see the additional value that they get from being surrounded by all the other benefits of The Economist. One thing when we're trying to reach the younger audiences, even some of the older audiences, like I'm trying not to just lead with finance, business, and politics. Really trying to communicate that, one, we are digital primarily, and we are not just weekly. So you get content every single day. So we do that by showcasing a ton of the content that comes out and showing the breadth of the content. So you'll see on social when we're pushing out content ads, a lot of it is content around behavioral economics, right? So what's the best age gap for a relationship, right? Like, should you send your children to private schools? Like those types of topical conversations that make people sit up and take notice rather than, okay, let me just learn about whatever economic policy in whatever country, which is also important. And some people obviously get very excited about it, but it's really meant to show we are a source of thoughtful analysis and reporting across a whole swath of topics.
See, that's so interesting. Earlier today, I just interviewed somebody from the Reuters Institute about news avoidance. And he said that one of the potential solutions to that is to show audiences that you aren't just writing about what your shareholders care about. It's writing about what the audience cares about. And so like this is a concerted effort to prove that The Economist is not just about, financial information and kind of that very hard political news. It's actually, much more broad and actually does speak to that audience who you're seeking to reach, rather.
Yeah. And news avoidance is really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about that recently. A lot of people, from what I've read, avoid the news because it's, one, there's just so much of it and they don't know how to filter it. And two, it's so dark and heavy and negative. And what they're searching for is the lighter content without being dumbed down, and also solution-oriented content. And that's where The Economist occupies a really unique place in that journalism landscape, because we do look at issues from all different sides, right? We flip it around, we flip it over, and we look at it and we analyze it from all different sides. And then we'll land on a perspective, and you understand why we landed there. You don't have to agree with it, but you've understood where we've landed, as opposed to the war in Ukraine is out of control. And then you're left to know what to do. Great. Yeah. Okay. So that's where I think, even more than ever, this style of journalism is really unique, and getting that marketing message out is through the types of content that we push is actually resonating quite well.
We're aware that news roundup may have generated a little bit of disagreement. If you disagree, or if you agree, or if you think we should just get in the bin, come and tell us. We have a community tab. We have a community forum. You can come and join us over at voices.media/community. We'd love to have you along. You can come and join 100 plus other media professionals and come and chat about the things that matter to you.
And I cannot believe that entries for our fifth, is that right? Our fifth Publisher
annual
Podcast Awards. They're closing in a week. Get your entries in, people. Go over to publisherpodcast.com. Take advantage of our free entry to the Publisher Podcast. And, be in the company of people like The Telegraph, The Financial Times, The Guardian, The Economist, and some scrappy smaller organisations like Reby Media and Simon Brew with Film Stories.
Where can you enter those?
I said publisherpodcast.com. Listen.
Did you?
Yes. Publisherpodcast.com. If you say it 5 times,
Peter appears in your mirror.
Yeah.
Publisherpodcast.com. Publisherpodcast.com. Publisherpodcast.com.
But for now, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Media Voices. If you've enjoyed it, please do send it on to somebody else. Please do recommend us. Every little helps. But for now, thank you so much for listening, and Yaki Da.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, it's St. David's Day.
Yeah.
Dewey San.